The dusty road from Jerusalem to Jericho was only 17 miles long. Why did Jesus choose it as the setting for one of his most famous parables? Was it just a convenient location? A random backdrop for a moral lesson? Or did everyone listening to him that day immediately feel their stomach tighten, remembering their own journey down that notorious path, or the stories of those who never made it back? What did travel actually mean in first-century Palestine? Not the romanticized image of peaceful shepherds wandering freely across sunlit hills, but the real, physical act of moving your body, your family, or your goods from one place to another through a landscape where danger wasn't an exception. It was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. The morning air in a Galilean village carried the sound of wooden doors scraping against stone thresholds as men emerged into the half-light before dawn. The decision to travel wasn't made lightly. A merchant from Capernaum, preparing to transport olive oil to Jerusalem for Passover, would have spent days considering not just his route, but his timing, his companions, and what he could afford to lose if things went wrong. His wife ground grain in the courtyard, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone, creating a pulse that had marked mornings in that house for generations. She didn't ask if he would be safe. She knew better. Instead, she prepared extra bread wrapped in cloth, a small container of dried fish, a water skin checked carefully for cracks. These weren't provisions for a journey. They were insurance against delay, against being forced to wait, against circumstances that could strand a traveler far from help. The roads themselves were not what we imagine when we hear the word road. The Romans had built their famous highways connecting major cities, straight, paved with fitted stones, marked with milestones. But these were arteries of empire, designed for legions and official couriers. For ordinary people, most travel happened on paths that had been walked into existence over centuries. Dusty tracks in summer, mud channels in winter, winding through terrain where geography dictated the route and vulnerability came with every turn. Between Jericho and Jerusalem, the path descended nearly 3,000 feet through a landscape the locals called the Way of Blood. Not because of any single massacre, but because of the steady accumulation of violence that gave the route its reputation. The terrain created the danger. Limestone hills rose on both sides, riddled with caves that offered perfect concealment. The road twisted through narrow passages where a traveler couldn't see what waited around the next bend. Water sources were scarce and predictable, which meant anyone who needed to drink had to stop at the same few springs, places where bandits knew exactly when desperate, thirsty people would appear. Bandits weren't organized criminals in the modern sense. They were often displaced farmers, men whose land had been seized for debt, or younger sons with no inheritance who faced a choice between starvation and taking from others what Rome's taxation system had denied them. Some were more desperate than dangerous, hoping to steal enough to survive another season. Others had become professionals, working in groups, knowing the rhythms of travel, the patterns of commerce, the seasons when roads filled with pilgrims carrying coins for the temple tax. A traveler alone was a target. This wasn't a moral failing or bad luck, it was mathematical certainty. One person couldn't watch all directions. One person couldn't fight off 3 or 4 attackers. One person found beaten and robbed on a remote stretch of road might not be discovered until animals had already done their work. So people traveled in groups, not because they particularly enjoyed company, but because survival required it. A merchant from Nazareth heading to Jerusalem for a festival didn't post an advertisement and wait for companions. He listened. In the marketplace, at the village well, in the synagogue courtyard after Sabbath services, he paid attention to who else was planning a journey south. He asked his cousins, his wife's relatives, the family of his daughter's betrothed. Travel plans spread through kinship networks and social obligations that predated the journey by generations. The assembly of a travel group revealed everything about first-century social structure. Wealthier merchants might hire guards, men who owned weapons and knew how to use them, whose presence alone could deter opportunistic attackers. But hiring protection cost money, and that expense had to be justified by the value of goods being transported. A farmer taking his produce to market couldn't afford guards. He relied instead on numbers, on the simple deterrent of a group large enough that attacking it meant real risk. Women almost never traveled alone. The danger wasn't just bandits. A woman without male family members present was vulnerable to different kinds of violation, and the shame that resulted could destroy not just her life, but her family's standing in the community. When women traveled, they moved within protective clusters. Mothers with daughters, sisters-in-law traveling to visit family, groups organized around kinship ties that obligated the men present to defend them as if defending their own blood. The timing of departure mattered as much as the composition of the group. Travelers left early, often before sunrise, hoping to cover the maximum distance before the afternoon heat made movement exhausting and dangerous. But leaving early also meant traveling through the coolest hours when mist still clung to valleys and visibility dropped, exactly when an ambush was hardest to detect until too late. The calculation was constant: speed versus safety, distance versus exposure. Every decision carried weight because the consequences were physical and immediate. At certain points along major routes, natural bottlenecks forced all traffic through the same narrow passages, a rocky defile where the path squeezed between cliff faces, a ford across a seasonal stream where the banks were too steep to cross anywhere else. These places accumulated tension. Travelers approaching them would slow, strain their eyes forward, listen for sounds that didn't belong. Sometimes they found other groups waiting, unwilling to enter alone, and a spontaneous alliance would form. Strangers who would walk together for an hour, bound by shared vulnerability, then separate without ever learning each other's names. The wealthy had options the poor did not. A landowner from Sepphoris traveling to Jerusalem could afford to send a servant ahead to arrange lodging at roadside inns, structures that were less hospitality and more fortified shelters where travelers could pay for a roof, a locked door, and the illusion of safety. These inns clustered at predictable intervals along major routes, positioned roughly a day's walk apart. But inn is a generous translation. Most were simple stone buildings built around a courtyard where animals could be secured. Travelers slept in communal rooms on raised platforms, their belongings clutched close, knowing that theft by fellow guests was as likely as attack from outside. The poorest travelers, day laborers, displaced families, those fleeing debt, had no access to inns. They slept in caves, in the open air during dry seasons, or huddled against village walls, hoping the proximity to inhabited spaces would deter the worst dangers. These were the people most vulnerable to everything: weather, wild animals, disease, and human predation. Their journeys weren't adventures, they were calculated gambles where the odds were never good. Water determined everything. A traveler could go days without food, but in the Palestinian heat, dehydration killed quickly. Wells and springs weren't random. They were known, named, fought over, and built into the mental maps every local carried. The well at Sychar, where Jesus spoke with the Samaritan woman, wasn't just a place to draw water. It was a strategic point, a necessary stop, a location where human paths intersected because physical necessity demanded it, but dependence on known water sources created predictability, and predictability created danger. Bandits didn't roam aimlessly, hoping to encounter victims. They positioned themselves near wells, knowing that thirsty travelers would come to them. The choice was simple and terrible: Risk dying of thirst, or risk walking into an ambush at the one place where water could be found. Some travelers carried weapons, not swords. Those were expensive, illegal for most Jews under Roman occupation, and marked their bearer as either a rebel or someone important enough to rob. Instead, they carried staffs, thick walking sticks that could double as clubs, or small knives ostensibly for cutting food, but available if needed for defense. These weren't military weapons, they were psychological tools, slight deterrents that might make a potential attacker think twice, choose an easier target, move on to someone even more vulnerable. The social code surrounding travel was unwritten but absolute. If you encountered someone injured or in distress on the road, the expectation was clear: you helped. Not because of religious obligation, though that existed too, but because everyone understood that next time, you might be the one lying beaten in the dust, hoping a stranger would stop. This reciprocity bound communities together across distances and differences, except it didn't always work. The priest and the Levite in Jesus' parable who passed by the wounded man weren't monsters. They were people making calculations every traveler understood. An injured person might be bait, a bandit lying in wait, or an accomplice whose role was to draw good Samaritans close enough to ambush. A person contaminated with blood created ritual impurity that could prevent a priest from performing his temple duties, costing him income and status. A dying person who expired while you were helping could leave you legally responsible, entangled in questions and obligations that followed you home. So people passed by, not always, not everyone, but often enough that Jesus could tell the story and know his audience wouldn't gasp in disbelief. They would nod in recognition, remembering the times they'd seen something troubling and kept walking, or heard about someone who had stopped to help and regretted it. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho, the specific setting Jesus chose, was notorious because it combined every danger. The descent was steep and isolated. Caves honeycombed the hills. Water was scarce. The traffic was heavy enough to attract professional bandits, but irregular enough that travelers often found themselves alone in vulnerable stretches. Everyone listening to Jesus that day knew exactly what it meant to make that journey. They'd either done it themselves, white-knuckling through the descent, or they knew someone who had been robbed, beaten, or worse. The economics of banditry shaped the reality of travel in ways modern readers rarely consider. Bandits didn't attack indiscriminately. They calculated. A well-dressed merchant riding a donkey laden with goods was worth the risk. A group of peasants carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs wasn't. This created a perverse dynamic where visible poverty became a form of protection, and any sign of wealth, a better quality cloak, a pair of sandals without holes, a donkey instead of walking, increased danger exponentially. Pilgrimage seasons transformed the risk calculations entirely. 3 times a year, Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, Jewish law required men to appear before the Lord in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of people converged on the city from throughout Palestine and beyond. The roads filled with humanity, moving in massive waves. For bandits, this was both opportunity and problem. The sheer volume of travelers meant rich targets, but the crowds also meant witnesses, organization, and the possibility of coordinated defense. Wealthier pilgrims traveled in organized caravans, hiring professional guides who knew not just the routes, but the current state of danger along them. These guides maintained relationships, sometimes paying protection money to bandit groups, sometimes receiving warnings about where to avoid, always navigating a gray zone where commerce and violence overlapped. A good guide was worth his fee, not because he knew the shortest path, but because he knew which longer route would get you there alive. Roman soldiers patrolled major roads, but their presence was sporadic and strategic. They protected routes critical to tax collection and military movement. They responded to attacks on Roman citizens or important provincial officials, but a Jewish farmer robbed on a back road between villages, that merited no investigation, no pursuit, no justice. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, was real for some and invisible for others, divided strictly along lines of citizenship, status, and economic value to the empire. This created a landscape where law existed but protection didn't, where everyone knew the rules, but also knew that enforcement was a privilege, not a right. When Jesus told his followers to go the extra mile with someone who compelled them to carry a burden, his audience understood the reference immediately. Roman soldiers could legally force civilians to carry military equipment for 1 mile, no more by law, but the law meant little on an empty road where a soldier with authority decided what happened next. The psychological weight of travel danger shaped more than individual journeys. It influenced where people lived, where they did business, whom they married. Villages positioned along dangerous routes were poorer, their populations more transient, their social structures weaker. No one built a prosperous farm beside the way of blood if they had any alternative. The places where bandits operated became zones of abandonment, regions that might be only miles from thriving communities, but felt like different worlds. Children grew up hearing stories that taught survival. Not fairy tales, but accounts of real journeys, real dangers, real consequences. A boy in Galilee learned that traveling alone was foolish, that strangers could be either salvation or death, that the world beyond his village was not an adventure, but a test where failure meant your body left for vultures. These weren't lessons taught in formal instruction. They were absorbed from every adult conversation, every worried departure, every relieved return. Women learned different lessons. They learned that their bodies made them targets in ways men weren't, that their safety depended entirely on male relatives willing and able to protect them, that a woman who traveled alone, even from necessity, would be assumed to be either desperate or immoral. And both assumptions brought danger. The Samaritan woman at the well coming alone in the heat of midday wasn't just unusual. It was a statement about her social isolation, her lack of protective relationships, her vulnerability that everyone in that culture would have recognized instantly. The concept of hospitality in the ancient Near East wasn't about friendliness, it was about survival architecture. When travelers had no safe commercial lodging, when roads were dangerous, when strangers had no legal protection, hospitality became the social technology that made travel possible. Opening your home to a stranger created obligations that bound both parties. The host provided safety, food, and shelter. The guest brought news, goods, and connections to the wider world. Both were vulnerable. The host to theft or violence, the guest to betrayal or abuse, and both relied on community enforcement of hospitality codes to make the system work. Abraham welcoming strangers who turned out to be angels wasn't a cute story about being nice to visitors. It was a narrative that reinforced the absolute necessity of hospitality in a world where travelers died without it. Lot offering his daughters to protect his guests wasn't a model of morality. It was an extreme illustration of how seriously hospitality obligations were taken, how completely a host was expected to defend those under his roof, even at horrific personal cost. When Jesus sent his disciples out with nothing, no money, no extra clothes, no food, he wasn't teaching a lesson about minimalism or trust in providence. He was forcing them into complete dependence on the hospitality system, making them experience the vulnerability that poor travelers faced constantly. They would knock on doors, not knowing if they'd be welcomed or rejected, fed or ignored, sheltered or left to sleep outside where anything could happen. The rejection of hospitality was so serious, it warranted shaking dust from sandals as testimony against a place. Not because rudeness deserved dramatic response, but because refusing to shelter vulnerable travelers was essentially sentencing them to possible death. Towns that turned away strangers were declaring themselves outside the mutual protection network that made civilization possible in a dangerous world. The Good Samaritan parable landed with explosive force, not because helping others was a novel idea, but because Jesus inverted every social calculation his audience used to navigate danger. The hero wasn't a fellow Jew who shared religious obligations. It was a Samaritan, a member of a group Jews considered heretical, unclean, dangerous. The injured man was Jewish, which meant accepting help from the Samaritan created debt to someone his community despised. The Samaritan didn't just offer momentary aid. He transported the wounded man, paid for extended care, promised to cover additional costs, exposing himself to financial exploitation, making himself vulnerable to a stranger who might repay kindness with accusation or worse. Everything about the story violated the survival logic everyone in Jesus' audience had learned from childhood. Trust your own people. Avoid outsiders. Don't make yourself vulnerable to strangers. Calculate costs before committing resources. Protect yourself first, because no one else will. Jesus wasn't teaching abstractions about loving neighbors. He was describing someone who rejected every survival instinct, every social boundary, every economic calculation that kept people safe in a dangerous world, and presented that rejection as the model of righteousness. The shock wasn't in the idea of helping. It was in helping like this, helping someone from a hostile group, helping at personal risk and cost, helping without reciprocity or social reward. The question, who is my neighbor? That prompted the parable wasn't academic curiosity. It was a genuine survival question. In a world where resources were scarce and danger constant, where helping the wrong person could destroy you, where strangers might be bandits and the injured might be bait, knowing exactly who deserved your help and who didn't wasn't callousness, it was wisdom. Jesus answered by making the category meaningless. Your neighbor is whoever needs help, regardless of whether helping them makes sense by any measure your society considers rational. This teaching became concrete on every road in Palestine. Every time someone traveled and encountered another person in distress, they faced the choice the parable described. Not a theoretical choice, but an immediate physical decision with real consequences. Stop or keep walking. Risk or protect yourself. Act like the Samaritan or like the priest and Levite. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho became a living parable. A place where theology had to survive contact with bandits, heat, fear, and the human instinct for self-preservation. Travel danger also illuminates dozens of other gospel moments. When Jesus walked through Samaria, taking the direct route between Galilee and Judea that most Jews avoided by traveling the longer path east of the Jordan, he wasn't just saving time. He was deliberately entering hostile territory where his presence invited confrontation. When he sent 72 disciples ahead to towns he planned to visit, he was using the standard safety practice of advance coordination, sending messengers to arrange hospitality before arriving vulnerable in an unfamiliar place. The urgency in Jesus' instructions about travel, go quickly, don't stop to greet people on the road, don't waste time, wasn't spiritual metaphor. It was practical wisdom about minimizing exposure to danger. Long conversations on roads meant standing still, being visible, becoming a target. The command to travel light wasn't about spiritual detachment. It was about mobility, about being able to move quickly when necessary, about not being weighed down when speed meant the difference between safety and disaster. When Jesus spoke about foxes having holes and birds having nests, but the Son of Man having nowhere to lay his head, his audience heard more than homelessness. They heard constant vulnerability, perpetual exposure to travel dangers. Life lived always in the spaces between secure locations where protection couldn't be guaranteed. They understood that his ministry required accepting the risks that everyone tried to minimize, making himself perpetually available to the dangers that careful people avoided. The resurrection appearances include Jesus walking with disciples on the road to Emmaus, a 7-mile journey from Jerusalem undertaken by two people processing grief and confusion, apparently traveling alone until Jesus joined them. The fact that they were on the road at all, that they walked for hours with a stranger, that they invited him to stay when evening came, all of this reflected the complex reality of travel where isolation created both danger and unexpected intimacy, where strangers might be threats or divine messengers, where hospitality obligations meant inviting unknown people into your most vulnerable spaces. Understanding how people traveled, why they feared it, what made it dangerous, and how they managed risk doesn't just add historical color to Bible reading. It transforms how we understand what Jesus asked of his followers. He didn't ask them to have nice thoughts about loving neighbors while staying safe in their villages. He sent them onto roads where people were beaten and robbed. He told them to trust strangers, depend on hospitality, make themselves vulnerable, and act with disregard for the survival calculations that kept everyone else alive. The faith he taught wasn't abstract belief in theological propositions. It was concrete trust enacted on dangerous roads in the presence of real threats, requiring choices that defied every instinct and social norm designed to protect people in a violent world. The question wasn't whether you believed the right doctrines. It was whether you would stop for the wounded stranger when stopping might destroy you. That choice is still being made. Not on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, but in every situation where safety and self-interest counsel walking past while something deeper, something that sounds like a Samaritan stopping for an enemy, whispers that your neighbor is whoever needs you, regardless of what it costs.
Neighbor is whoever needs you, regardless of cost. Revolutionary call persisting across centuries.